The air in the Sterling manufacturing archives was a perpetually stale mix of aged paper and industrial dust, a scent Mikey O'Connell knew intimately, a smell that clung to his clothes and hair even after he'd left for the day. It was 1982, and the large, drafty room, tucked away in the furthest corner of the sprawling factory complex, felt less like a functional part of a bustling enterprise and more like a forgotten tomb. Sunlight, when it managed the formidable task of piercing the grime on the high, arched windows, didn't so much illuminate as it highlighted the pervasive neglect, catching on dancing motes in the air, tiny galaxies of forgotten particles, and occasionally on the worn sleeves of Mikey's faded blue work shirt. He was 22, his frame lean, almost gangly, and his brown hair, a shade lighter than the dust motes, perpetually fell across his brow, a constant, minor annoyance he often swept away with the back of a hand. His current task, a mountain of cardboard boxes labeled MISC 1968 to 1972, seemed designed to swallow him whole. Each box, heavy with the weight of forgotten history, held a jumbled collection of invoices, yellowed blueprints for machinery long since obsolete, and glossy product brochures for items Sterling no longer even manufactured. He'd learned to distinguish the subtle scent of carbon copy paper from the richer, almost sweet smell of aged parchment. Mr. Henderson, Mikey's immediate supervisor, a man whose spirit seemed as gray and desiccated as the oldest files, had given him the job with a dismissive wave of a hand, barely looking up from his lunchtime crossword puzzle. "Just get him sorted, O'Connell," Henderson had grunted, his voice dry as rust, "and don't make a mess." Mikey had simply nodded, the familiar resignation settling in his gut. He'd been in this department for 3 years now, ever since leaving school, a stopgap job that had somehow, insidiously, become his anchor. His friends from school had either left town for bigger cities, their ambition a sharp contrast to his own inertia, or joined the army, or were stuck on the factory floor, facing the constant, chilling threat of layoffs that seemed to hang over Sterling like a permanent cloud. Mikey felt a quiet dread about his own future, a sense of being trapped in a slowly decaying world, like a fly caught in amber. He often found himself staring out the window, past the grimy panes, at the distant, smoke-stacked skyline, imagining a different life beyond the ceaseless clatter and hum of Sterling, a life where the air didn't taste of metal and old paper. He sighed, the sound lost in the vast quiet of the archives, pulling a thick, oversized folder from a box marked, Property Deeds Acquisitions. The folder was heavier than expected, almost bursting at its seams, its manila cover bowed under the strain. He set it aside, a minor curiosity piqued, but not enough to distract him from the immediate, soul-numbing task. His mother, Agnes, worried constantly about the plant's future, her hushed phone calls with neighbors about declining orders and union negotiations a constant, low thrum in the background of their evenings. That evening, the O'Connell kitchen, small and smelling warmly of Agnes's shepherd's pie, was warm but tense. The rotary phone on the wall, its cream plastic slightly yellowed with age, sat silent, but its very presence felt heavy, a symbol of potential bad news always hovering just out of reach. Agnes, her hands worn from years of factory work before she was laid off, looked at Mikey across the chipped Formica tabletop with a familiar mix of love and concern. "How was your day, love?" she asked, her voice softer than the factory floor ever allowed. The underlying question, unspoken but always present, was about job security, about the plant, about survival. Mikey recounted the mundane details of the archives, the dust, the endless boxes, the particular difficulty of deciphering Mr. Henderson's crabbed handwriting on a label. He carefully omitted the profound boredom that often threatened to swallow him whole, the feeling that his brain was slowly turning to mush amidst the forgotten paperwork. He felt a pang of guilt, knowing his mother deserved more than his quiet resignation, more than this muted existence. He watched the news on their old, boxy television set, the local anchor's voice a solemn drone as he talked about rising unemployment and interest rates, the grim statistics mirroring their own anxieties, echoing the hushed phone calls his mother made. Agnes nodded slowly, stirring her tea, her gaze distant, fixed on some unseen point beyond the flickering screen. Back in the archives the next morning, the air still thick with the ghosts of paper, the property deeds acquisitions folder seemed to call to him. It had a peculiar weight, a sense of something significant, a feeling that went beyond its physical bulk. He pushed aside the misc boxes and reached for it, the manila cover feeling oddly cool beneath his fingertips. He opened it, revealing not just the expected deeds, but a fascinating collection of correspondence, several faded, sepia-toned photographs of a barren plot of land, and a series of meticulously handwritten notes, their ink surprisingly vibrant against the yellowed paper. One document, a brittle, yellowed lease agreement from 1969, caught his eye. Its edges crackled slightly as he carefully unfolded it. It detailed Sterling Manufacturing's option to purchase a large tract of land on the outskirts of town, land that was now, he vaguely remembered, home to a newly built electronics plant, one of the few thriving businesses in the area, a beacon of modern industry in a landscape of aging factories. The lease had an unusually long exercise period, stretching out for decades, and the terms seemed incredibly favorable, almost too good to be true. A steal even by 1969 standards. Mikey frowned, a flicker of genuine curiosity, sharp and unexpected, replacing his usual apathy. Why hadn't Sterling exercised this option? The document itself was clearly marked, stamped boldly in fading red ink, urgent, action required, yet it had been filed away and forgotten, buried under a decade of dust and indifference, waiting for someone like Mikey O'Connell to unearth it. He spent the rest of that day, and then the next, lost in a world of yellowed paper and fading ink. The air in the archives, usually just heavy with the scent of dust and neglect, now felt charged with a quiet anticipation. Mikey meticulously cross-referenced every document, his fingers smudged with grime as he pulled out old city maps from a tall, metal cabinet that groaned on its ancient casters. He spread them across a cleared space on his desk, tracing the intricate boundaries of the land with a pencil that left faint, silvery lines. The scale of it, even on paper, was immense. During his lunch breaks, he'd ride his bike to the public library, the handlebars vibrating under his grip, and spend precious minutes hunched over a microfiche reader. The tiny, flickering screen would illuminate his face as he scrolled through old newspapers, the hum of the machine a constant backdrop to his search. He found a few articles detailing the initial proposal for an electronics plant in the mid-1970s, followed by the subsequent land acquisition by a different, much larger company. A small, almost imperceptible spark ignited within him as he compared the dates. The original option held by Sterling seemed to predate the sale, an anomaly that snagged at his mind. This wasn't just forgotten history, he realized, his heart thrumming a little faster. It felt like a forgotten opportunity, a buried treasure waiting to be unearthed. He tried to speak to Mr. Henderson, the factory manager, the following afternoon. Henderson was hunched over his desk, studying a racing form, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and desperation. Mikey, holding the folder like a shield, laid out the documents, carefully pointing out the discrepancy, the dates that refused to line up. Henderson barely looked up, his eyes fixed on the handicaps. Old papers, Mikey, he grunted, not even bothering to shift his gaze. Probably expired. Everything expires eventually. He waved Mikey away with a flick of his wrist, the dismissive gesture a familiar, dull sting that settled deep in Mikey's chest. Mikey retreated, the folder clutched tight against his side, a heavy knot forming in his stomach. He knew Henderson wouldn't understand, or perhaps, didn't want to. The thought was a cold, hard stone. Henderson had given up, it seemed, long ago. Undeterred, Mikey decided he needed a different angle, a different ear. He remembered an older man, Mr. Davies, who had worked in the property division for decades before retiring a few years back. Davies had always seemed to carry the weight of Sterling's history in his bones. Mikey found Davies' number in an old, brittle company directory, the pages yellowed and brittle at the edges. With a nervous breath, he dialed it from the payphone outside the factory during his next break. The receiver felt cold against his ear, the plastic worn smooth by countless hands. The static-filled connection crackled, a faint hiss beneath the ringing, until an old, gruff voice answered, thick with the sound of a television in the background. Mikey explained his find, carefully, hesitantly, choosing his words with an almost painful precision. He laid out the timeline, the conflicting dates, the peculiar nature of the option. There was a long silence on the other end, punctuated only by the distant murmur of the TV, then a slow, thoughtful, HMMPH. Davies agreed to meet him at a local diner, the Comet, the following Saturday morning. "Don't be late, boy," he added, before the line clicked dead. Mikey felt a surge of nervous excitement, a feeling that buzzed beneath his skin like a trapped fly. This was a step outside his dusty world, a tentative foray into something potentially significant. He didn't tell his mother, not yet. He wanted to be sure first, to have something concrete, something more than a whisper of a possibility, before raising her hopes. The weight of the folder in his worn satchel felt different now, no longer just old paper, but a potential key to a future he hadn't dared to imagine. The Comet Diner was bustling on Saturday morning, a symphony of clattering plates, the cheerful chatter of families, and the hiss of the coffee machine. It was a stark contrast to the quiet, stale air of the Sterling archives. Mikey sat in a red vinyl booth, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thick ceramic mug, his gaze anxiously flicking towards the door every few seconds. He felt conspicuously out of place, his usual work clothes swapped for a clean, if slightly faded, plaid shirt and jeans. When Mr. Davies finally arrived, he was older, more stooped than Mikey remembered, his movements slower, but his eyes still held a sharp, shrewd intelligence that seemed to miss nothing. He ordered a black coffee and a stack of pancakes, then leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Mikey, a silent command to begin. Mikey carefully laid out the documents, the maps, the microfiche printouts, explaining his findings, the timelines, the forgotten option. Davies listened intently, occasionally nodding, his expression unreadable, chewing slowly on a piece of bacon. When Mikey finished, the silence stretched, broken only by the diner's ambient noise. Davies took a long sip of coffee, the steam warming his weathered face. Sterling had a lot of irons in the fire back then, he mused, his voice raspy, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. That land. Yes, I remember it. Old man Sterling, the founder, he had a vision for it. A new division, maybe even a research facility. But then the '73 oil crisis hit, the market went south, and things got tight. The project was shelved, the papers filed away. Everyone forgot about it. Or, rather, he paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, everyone chose to forget. Davies explained that the option was unusually structured, tied to specific development milestones rather than a simple expiry date. If those milestones hadn't been met by the current landowners, the option could still be valid. It was a long shot, a legal labyrinth, Davies warned, but not impossible. He cautioned Mikey about the inertia within Sterling, the old guard's resistance to anything that disrupted the status quo. "You'll be trying to wake a sleeping giant, Mikey," Davies said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "And giants don't like being woken up." He then gave Mikey the name of a junior lawyer, Eleanor Vance, who had worked in Sterling's legal department briefly before moving to a smaller, more dynamic firm. "She's sharp," Davies said, pushing his empty plate away. "And she doesn't mind a fight." Armed with this new lead, Mikey felt a renewed sense of purpose, a fire that burned brighter than before. He spent his evenings at the library, not just with microfiche, but poring over legal texts and property law, trying to understand the nuances Davies had hinted at. The dusty sleeves of his work shirts now felt less like a uniform of drudgery and more like a badge of honor, a symbol of his quiet, determined pursuit. He called Eleanor Vance's firm from a payphone, the receiver cold against his ear, the coins clunking loudly as they dropped. He explained his situation to her secretary, a woman with a brisk, no-nonsense voice who, after a moment of hesitation, put him through. Eleanor's voice was clear, confident, and slightly impatient, a sharp contrast to the static-laden calls he was used to. She agreed to a brief meeting, more out of curiosity than conviction, at her office downtown. Eleanor Vance's office was modern, sleek, and filled with sunlight that streamed through large windows, a stark, almost blinding contrast to the dim, cavernous spaces of Sterling Manufacturing. She was in her late 20s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, her dark hair pulled back severely from her face, not a strand out of place. Her initial impression of Mikey was one of polite skepticism. He looked like a factory worker, his hands still showing traces of grease, his worn shoes scuffing slightly on her polished floor, utterly out of place in her gleaming, efficient world. As he carefully laid out the documents, the old maps, the faded newspaper clippings, she listened, her expression unblinking, her gaze sharp and analytical. He explained the original lease, the development clauses, the subsequent sale, and the potential implications, his voice gaining a quiet authority as he spoke. She picked up the faded lease agreement, her brow furrowing slightly as she read, her finger tracing a line of archaic legal jargon. "This is unusual," she admitted, tapping a finger on a specific clause. "Very unusual. If the original development schedule wasn't met, Sterling could still have a claim. But proving that after all these years? It would be a monumental task." She looked up at Mikey then, a new assessment in her eyes, a flicker of something beyond polite dismissal. "Why are you doing this, Mr. O'Connell? What's in it for you?" Mikey stammered, feeling a sudden rush of heat to his face. He explained his hope for the company, for his mother, for a future that wasn't just dusty archives and slow decline. He spoke of the factory, the people, the quiet desperation that had settled over everything. Eleanor nodded slowly, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "All right," she said, a glint in her eye that suggested a challenge accepted. "I'll look into it. But this will be on my own time, and it will be difficult. Don't expect miracles." Over the next few weeks, Mikey and Eleanor met frequently, often late in the evenings after her work, at a quiet coffee shop downtown, its fluorescent lights humming softly. He supplied her with every document he could find, every old map, every newspaper clipping, meticulously organized in new folders he'd bought with his meager savings. She, in turn, explained the legal hurdles, the need for irrefutable evidence, the formidable opponents they would face: the current owners of the electronics plant, a powerful corporation with deep pockets and a team of high-priced lawyers. She discovered that the electronics plant had indeed fallen behind on its original development promises, using the land for a different purpose than initially outlined in the original planning permits referenced in Sterling's option. The legal case was weak, she admitted, but not impossible. Their alliance, initially one of convenience, slowly deepened. Eleanor, beneath her cool, professional exterior, was genuinely impressed by Mikey's tenacity and his quiet idealism, a quality she rarely encountered in her cynical world. Mikey, in turn, found himself drawn to her sharp intellect and unwavering determination, the way her eyes would light up when she found a new angle. He felt a burgeoning confidence he hadn't known he possessed, a sense of capability that had been dormant for too long. He even started dressing better, paying more attention to his appearance, driven by a quiet desire to match her professionalism, to be seen as her equal, even if only in his own mind. The turning point came when Sterling Manufacturing announced another round of significant layoffs. The news swept through the factory like a cold front, chilling every corner. Morale plummeted. Henderson seemed even more defeated, his shoulders slumped lower than usual, the factory floor quieter, more ominous, the machines humming with a mournful drone. Mikey knew they had to act now, before the last vestiges of hope were extinguished. He and Eleanor worked late into the night, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the urgency of their mission, preparing a concise, compelling report. It outlined their findings, the legal precedent, and the potential claim with undeniable clarity. They requested a meeting with Mr. Davies, not the retired Mr. Davies who had given them the lead, but the current head of Sterling's legal department, a formidable man known for his conservative approach and his unwavering loyalty to the aging CEO, Mr. Sterling Sr. The meeting was tense. The legal department's conference room was formal and hushed, the heavy oak table reflecting the overhead lights. Mr. Davies, a portly man with thinning gray hair and a perpetually stern expression, listened to Eleanor's presentation with an air of barely concealed impatience, occasionally shifting in his chair. Mikey, sitting beside Eleanor, felt a tremor of nerves, a cold knot in his stomach, but he met Davies' gaze steadily, refusing to look away. Eleanor presented the evidence with precision, highlighting the potential value of the land, the legal precedent, and the dire financial implications for a struggling Sterling. Davies scoffed, a dry, dismissive sound that echoed in the quiet room. "This is old news, Ms. Vance. We looked into this years ago. It's a dead end, a waste of time and resources." He dismissed Mikey with a curt glance, his eyes lingering for just a moment, filled with unconcealed disdain. "And I don't appreciate junior employees digging up ancient history and distracting our legal counsel with pipe dreams." Eleanor, however, was undeterred. Eleanor, her expression a careful mask of professional calm, reached into her briefcase and produced a thick, aged envelope. From it, she withdrew a single, folded sheet of paper, its edges yellowed and brittle. It was a letter, dated nearly 50 years prior, bearing the letterhead of a law firm long since absorbed into a larger entity. She laid it gently on the polished mahogany table before Mr. Davies, who watched her with a mixture of annoyance and suspicion. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as his eyes, accustomed to scanning endless legal documents, quickly took in the sender and recipient. "This isn't a pipe dream, Mr. Davies," Eleanor stated, her voice firm but even, the slight rustle of the paper the loudest sound in the room. "This is a letter from Sterling's original legal team, advising against letting the land option lapse. It explicitly outlines its unique clauses that your department, I'm afraid, overlooked." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. It was buried, as Mr. O'Connell discovered, in a separate, obscure file, labeled only, Miscellaneous Correspondence 1937. Quote, Davies bristled, a faint flush creeping up his neck. His gaze flickered from the letter to Eleanor, then to Mikey, who sat quietly beside her, his hands clasped, trying to appear smaller than he felt. The mention of millions, the potential asset, the explicit advice from a respected, long-dead lawyer whose name still carried a certain weight in legal circles, seemed to pierce through Davies's carefully constructed complacency. He picked up the letter, turning it over in his hands as if searching for a trick. The paper felt fragile, yet its message was anything but. "This is a potential asset worth millions, Mr. Davies," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining a quiet intensity. "Potentially saving hundreds of jobs and revitalizing this entire company. Are you prepared to dismiss that without a full, thorough investigation?" Davies stared at the letter for another long moment, the silence stretching, heavy with unspoken accusations and the sudden, inconvenient truth. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. I will present these findings to Mr. Sterling Sr. and the board," he conceded, his voice grudging, each word pulled from him with visible effort. He looked at them, a flicker of something that might have been resentment in his eyes. "But don't get your hopes up. Corporate law is a minefield." Mikey left that meeting feeling a dizzying mix of triumph and trepidation. They had won a battle, a small, crucial skirmish, but the war, he knew, was far from over. Eleanor offered him a brief, almost imperceptible nod as they stepped out into the bustling corridor, a silent acknowledgement of the small victory. The board meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday, a day that felt unusually heavy with expectation, the air thick with an unspoken tension that permeated the entire Sterling building. Mikey, dressed in his best, slightly ill-fitting suit, a relic from a cousin's wedding years ago, sat beside Eleanor in a sterile, wood-paneled conference room on the executive floor. The air conditioning hummed, a low, constant drone that seemed to mock the clatter and grind of the factory floor far below, a world away. Mr. Sterling Sr., a man whose face was a roadmap of the company's long and often difficult history, sat at the head of the long, polished table. His expression was unreadable, his eyes, deep-set and weary, seemed to hold the weight of decades. Around him sat other board members, a collection of tired executives and cautious investors, their faces ranging from skepticism to mild curiosity. Eleanor began her presentation, her voice calm and authoritative, a stark contrast to the nervous flutter in Mikey's stomach. She detailed the legal intricacies of the forgotten land option, the current market value of the property, and the potential for either a massive, headline-grabbing lawsuit or a lucrative out-of-court settlement. She projected financial figures onto a screen using an overhead projector, the whir of its fan a counterpoint to her steady voice, demonstrating how the acquisition of the land, or the substantial compensation from its current occupants, could inject desperately needed capital into Sterling manufacturing. This, she explained, would allow for modernization, expansion, and a crucial shift away from obsolescence. When called upon, Mikey felt a sudden rush of blood to his ears. He stood, his knees feeling a little weak, and spoke about the discovery process, the forgotten files, the dusty archives, and the stark reality of the company's decline from the perspective of someone on the ground. He spoke not just of numbers and legal clauses, but of the people, the jobs that could be saved, the potential for a new future for Sterling. His voice, initially a little shaky, gained a newfound confidence as he described the human cost of their current trajectory. His quiet observations, born from years of watching the company slowly decay, carried a weight that surprised even himself. He spoke with a sincerity that was impossible to ignore, painting a vivid picture of a once proud factory now limping along, and the glimmer of hope this discovery offered. Mr. Davies, still visibly uncomfortable, shifted in his seat but, to Mikey's surprise, grudgingly supported their findings. He admitted that the legal department had indeed overlooked the nuances of the original agreement, a concession that felt monumental in its rarity. The board deliberated for what felt like an eternity. The tension in the room was palpable, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on everyone. Minutes stretched into an hour, then another, filled with hushed conversations and the rustle of papers. Mikey watched the faces around the table, trying to decipher their thoughts, but their expressions remained largely impassive. Finally, Mr. Sterling Sr. cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the quiet room. All eyes turned to him. He spoke, his voice raspy with age but firm, of the company's legacy, of the difficult times they had endured, and of the need for bold, decisive action. He looked first at Mikey, then at Eleanor, his gaze lingering for a moment on each of them. "We will pursue this," he announced, the words resonating with a quiet authority. "Ms. Vance, you will lead the legal team. Mr. O'Connell, you will assist her, providing all necessary historical documentation and support. We will fight for what is ours." A ripple of murmurs went through the room, a mix of relief and renewed determination. Mikey felt a dizzying surge of elation, a sense of vindication that almost brought tears to his eyes. He exchanged a quick, triumphant glance with Eleanor, a shared victory in their eyes that spoke volumes without a single word. It was a silent, powerful acknowledgement of their combined effort, a moment etched into his memory. The legal battle that ensued was protracted and arduous, stretching over nearly a year. The powerful corporation currently occupying the land fought back fiercely, employing a battery of high-priced lawyers who seemed to materialize from thin air. There were endless depositions, mountains of paperwork that threatened to bury them, and moments of despair when it seemed their meticulously built case might crumble under the sheer weight of the opposition's resources. Mikey found himself working side by side with Eleanor, day in and day out, often spending late nights in her office, the fluorescent lights humming overhead as they sifted through new documents, prepared briefs, and even practiced for his testimony. He learned the intricate dance of corporate law, the art of negotiation, and the brutal, often unforgiving reality of high-stakes litigation. His dusty sleeves, once a symbol of his quiet, overlooked existence, were replaced by crisp, clean shirts, his quiet demeanor by a focused intensity that surprised even himself. He became indispensable to Eleanor, his deep, almost encyclopedic knowledge of Sterling's archives proving invaluable, often unearthing the precise piece of information they needed at a critical moment. Their professional relationship blossomed into a deep mutual respect, tinged with an unspoken affection that grew in the quiet hours of their shared work. There were moments of shared, exhausted laugh over cold coffee, a hand brushing accidentally as they reached for the same file, a lingering glance across the table when one of them made a particularly insightful point that hinted at something more, something deeper than mere colleagues. They navigated the complex legal landscape not just as lawyer and assistant, but as partners, each relying implicitly on the other. Eventually, after nearly a year of relentless legal wrangling, a settlement was reached. It wasn't the full acquisition of the land. The opposing corporation had too much power, too many resources to allow that, but it was a substantial financial compensation that far exceeded anyone's initial expectations. The sum was enough, more than enough, to save Sterling Manufacturing from the brink of collapse, allowing for significant investment in new machinery, crucial research, and much-needed development. The news spread like wildfire through the factory, igniting a flicker of hope that had long been extinguished in the weary hearts of the workers. Layoffs were halted, and plans for modernization and expansion were announced, promising a future that, just a year prior, had seemed impossible. Mikey's life changed dramatically. He was offered a new position, not in the archives, but in a newly formed corporate strategy department, reporting directly to Mr. Sterling Jr., who was now taking a more active role in the company's revitalized future. His new role was to identify and leverage overlooked assets, a testament to his unique discovery and the quiet tenacity he had shown. He still visited the archives sometimes, not to sort dusty boxes, but to supervise a new, enthusiastic junior archivist, passing on his meticulous methods and sharing stories of the hidden treasures within. The room, though still carrying the scent of old paper and dust, now felt like a place of potential, not just forgotten history. One crisp autumn evening, a few months after the settlement had been finalized and the first new machines were humming to life in the factory, Mikey and Eleanor stood on a low hill overlooking the revitalized Sterling plant. The air was cool and carried the faint, sweet scent of burning leaves from distant gardens. New lights shone brightly from its windows, a warm, inviting glow against the deepening twilight, and the hum of upgraded machinery was a steady, hopeful sound, a symphony of possibility. Eleanor, now a senior partner at her firm, had secured a new, lucrative contract with Sterling, solidifying her own professional triumph. She turned to him, her profile silhouetted against the factory lights. "You did it, Mikey," she said, her voice soft, a rare, genuine smile gracing her lips, visible even in the dim light. "You really did it." He looked at her, the city lights reflecting in her eyes, making them sparkle with a warmth he hadn't often seen. The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with shared history and unspoken understanding. "We did it, Eleanor," he corrected gently, a warmth spreading through him, a feeling that settled deep in his chest. He thought of his mother, no longer worried, her face now often alight with pride for her son, and of the winding, unexpected path he had forged for himself. His dusty sleeves had indeed led him to a golden dream, not just of wealth or success, but of purpose, of impact, and of a future he had once only dared to imagine. The journey had been long, fraught with doubt and resistance, but standing there, watching the lights of a company reborn, feeling the quiet strength of the woman beside him, he knew every moment had been worth it. He shifted his weight, and for a moment, their shoulders brushed. She didn't move away. He looked back at the factory, its new life pulsing in the twilight. The hum of the machinery was no longer a dirge, but a vibrant, living sound, a promise. He felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet joy that settled deep within him. The air grew colder, and he saw her shiver slightly. He hesitated, then reached out, his hand hovering for a moment, before gently, almost imperceptibly, touching her arm. It's getting late, he murmured, his voice softer than he intended. Eleanor turned her head slowly, her gaze meeting his, and for a long moment, everything else faded away. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips again. A smile that held a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had been through, and perhaps, everything that lay ahead. If this story left any impression on you, or reminded you of a moment from your own life, feel free to share it in the comments. Even a small memory is enough. Stories from the past often carry meaning we only begin to understand much later. Your memory might become part of someone else's story.